Okay, everyone. So welcome back from the coffee break. I think we can get started with the next invited talk. The speaker for this one is Professor Janet Wiles. She's a professor for human-centered computing at the University of Queensland, and she also leads the Future Technologies thread at the ARC Center of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language. And she's done research in the intersection of language technologies, psychology, and robotics. And so, yeah, we are very excited to hear your talk, Janet. The stage is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. This is coming from a very different perspective than the last talks that we've heard this morning. So I want to look at what social robotics and language tech can learn from the language sciences. And I'm coming to you from Brisbane, and I'd like to acknowledge the languages of the area where I am at Turrbal and Yagara, and I pay my deep respects to all elders past, present on this land. The image on this slide is a mural in a shopping centre painted a couple of years ago. It's a social roboticist meeting her robot, her social robot, for the first time. And the robot here is a palm cockatoo. This is actually a rare bird from northern Queensland. It sends messages through the rainforest by breaking small branches, fashioning drumsticks and drums on hollow trees. So the bird is a reminder that communication is embodied, just like robots. And in this talk, I want to talk particularly about how human languages are inherently contextual, particularly in terms of geographic and peripersonal space, and also inherently ambiguous. So there are a couple of robots that my lab has developed as research tools. The iRat is a rat-sized robot developed to study neural processes and navigation, and it became repurposed for language studies when we were doing LingoDroid projects, which I'll mention in this talk. The other robots are called OP robots, and they're child-friendly robots. They might seem unusual sort of robots to teach us about language. However, in science, the simplest robots sometimes have quite surprising things to talk about, to teach us about. So I want to talk about fundamental principles of grounding, how robots can learn language, and then I'll use color terms and spatial language. So color terms are fundamental in cognitive psychology for probing how cognition works and categories work. And then I want to talk, reach out a little bit further back to universals of language. Okay, so if we start, what does a robot need to know about language? We kind of ask this question, could a robot understand language? What would it even mean to understand? And from an engineering question, what aspects of language could a robot understand? And then demonstrate its understanding. So if we go back to how words get meaning, we can say, we see a cat. We recognize it's a cat. Maybe the touch, the feel, the sound, but primarily a lot of it is the sight of it, the way it moves. And then we have a word. The word has a grounded meaning in the cat, but how do the people know it? And it's not just one person. It's actually, how do we know it as a society? And it differs obviously for every language. So each individual has a private way of identifying what the cat is. We call this a private grounding. And then there's an agreement that we will use the term cat for this. So this is called the triangle of meaning. It goes back more than 100 years to Peirce, also called the semiotic triangle. And the question is, does this triangle of meaning work with robots? Could robots share common ground, either with each other or with humans? And that's what a lot of our work was about in both the OP and the LingoDroids project. So OP is very, very simple robot that allows children to play games. In particular, I'm going to talk about a color game. And how does Peirce's triangle of meaning work in practice with a robot and a child? Okay, so here's a color game. the question is not, can the child teach the robot, but in this, not can the robot teach the child, but the robot learns from the child. So the robot says, hello, it's nice to meet you. The robot's name is Opie. Can you name this color? And the child will name the color. In this case, the child will say purple. Can you name the new color? And the child might say blue or dark blue. Do you think these colors are the same? So this is switching from the naming of colors to learning about relationships between them. And the child might say, no, they're not the same. Okay, so what's the difference? And then the robot can begin to learn what is the relationship that the child sees between these colors. So the question is, what's actually going on in the grounding between a child's understanding of color and a robot learning to understand color? And there are a couple of different aspects to this. One is the actual terms themselves cannot identify color from a word and a word from the color patch, but also what about the color space itself? So the triangle of meaning for the child is that purple refers to the color purple, but they don't experience it in the same way. The robot is representing it in a color space, so it gets an instance of purple, another instance, a third instance. So it has different examples to understand the concept of purple. It's going to have to generalize over those. Then it sees a different color, blue, another one. And then the game switches from name this color to what's the difference. So with two patches, what's the difference? It's lighter. The robot is now able to do something interesting. It can begin to label the dimensions of difference in its color space. So in this case, hue and intensity. So we often think from a physics point of view that color is a property of the object, just pure physics. But it's actually not. We construct color, and it's constructed differently and named differently across different languages. And there's a lot of subtle differences around how different cultures group color together. Okay, so let's take this and go beyond. Cats and colors are things that the robot can see. Could it be used, could this triangle of meaning be used for things the robot can't see, such as words for space and words for time? So one of the reasons why we focus on space is because space is actually at the heart of human cognition, but we can't see it, we can't touch it or taste it. Our sense of space is constructed. So these two IRAT robots are called lingo droids, so lingo, language droids. To make the robots as autonomous as possible in this particular language game, we don't teach them names, they invent them using two-syllable nonsense codes. They each have private grounding, so each of them is able to look at its location. So the game here is, where are we? They each have a map, so this is a top-down view of a maze that the robots wander through. When they meet at a given place, they say, where are we? And then if they have a name, one of them says it, but if not, one of them will invent a name. So in this particular case, Gifu is this location. And it can do the same thing as color, where it can use the same term in a small region, and there will be different terms across the whole of space. So toponyms are words for places, temponyms are words for time, and you can play this with time as well. Okay, so here's a quick quiz. Does a robot need to know which is a space word and which is a time word? And Scott Heath, who was doing this work, asked, well, could you just get an instance of something like Zuku? Now, the robot who speaks this has decided whether this is a space or time word, but the one who's listening just has a single instance. Initially, we don't know if this is a space or time word. And then you might get another word, Yozo. Is this a space or time word? Again, we don't know. But through cross-situational learning, you can exploit the variation, if you get a lot of instances of Zuku, to work out that this is highly specific for space, but not time. And then again with Yozo, this is highly specific for time and not space. So it's possible in these systems to begin to learn not just instances and name them. And this naming can be done from a single shot learning from nonsense words, and then from there to go on to the different dimensions that underpin it. All right, so if we try and tie back the LingoDroid sign system, how does it actually represent what's going on? So the referent, or the object, is in the world itself, and the internal representation of the robot is in green. So this is the private grounding. The robot has a camera image, a local view, local pose, odometry, wheel encoders. It's performing SLAM. It looks complicated, but there's something really interesting here. The words are not linked to the sensor inputs for the robot, but rather to the way they construct experiences, distances, and directions. And then the lexicons that it builds out of this are tied to these higher level concepts. And over a lot of specific instances, it can go from distance elements to a distance space, from direction elements to a direction space. So because this learning is single shot, you get one instance to hear the word. A robot gets one instance to hear a word. It can be tied to many experiences. It ends up, we have a very simple data structure. It's just a simple matrix. Each word ends up with a distributed representation across a whole variety of different experiences. So I would like to stop there and move from how we study LingoDroids with language learning for space to how the brain represents space, because I think it's quite useful in this question of how much do you build in and how much does a system learn? And clearly for humans, we do quite a lot of both. So the SLAM system that underpins LingoDroids is called RATSLAM, and it was inspired by how the mammalian brain, in particular, rats, represent space. So there are cells called place cells deep in the subcortical areas of the brain called the hippocampus. And each of these lines is colored lines is the firing of cell. The rat runs along a track, and first you get the red cells firing, and then orange, yellow, green, and blue as it moves along the track. And every time it runs through the same place, the same cell will fire. That's why they're called place cells. Discovered more than 60 years ago. And recently, the discoverer was awarded a Nobel Prize for these. So is it enough to construct a map of space with just place cells? And it turns out the brain does have, this is a place cell looking top down into a circular arena, and the hippocampus, but there's a lot more to it. You can't know as you run along a track whether you're running east or west unless you have head direction cells. And there are head direction cells in many different parts of the brain. The head direction cells, there's a lot of uncertainty. You can work out your head direction from vision, but also from hearing. Rats get it from smell. You can get it from wind direction. There's a lot of different sensory inputs. Some of them are more certain at one time. If you close your eyes, the visual input for head direction is not nearly as strong. The representation of place cells and head direction is egocentric. It's with respect to the movement of the body itself. There are also cells called grid cells and boundary cells that are allocentric. They're with respect to the world. And the mammalian brain very flexibly maps between representations that are with respect to the body. And there are many different coordinate systems in the body with respect to the head, the torso, different parts of your arm or your hand. But then there are also, in navigation as well, a lot of other cells. So there are goal cells, object cells, egocentric, and spatial coordinates. So the message of this diagram is that brains have highly structured neural circuits for space, and they each play a role in both egocentric and allocentric navigation. Do we need all this? And from an evolutionary perspective, if evolution could have got away without this complexity, it probably would have. So one of the questions is, ultimately, we want robots to talk to humans, not just other robots. Our reality is actually going to be very different. How different can two realities be and still be linked by a shared spatial language, in particular human languages? So Scott Heath did a study where he had two different robots. One on the left, the laser bot, uses a 2D laser scanner. The IRAT uses camera-based path mapping. So you have one representation where there are boundaries of the world, but no paths, and the other where there are paths through the world, but no boundaries. Both of them are able to perform SLAM reasonably well. And it turns out they each have different, very different private grounding of the world, but their maps are able to be joined through the social sharing of words for different places in the world. So they don't need the same bodies. They don't need the same constructed maps. What they do need is a shared culture for the task that they're involved in. They needed to know that they were playing the where are we game, or the how far, or the what direction. Okay, so one of the things that's interesting here is that word meanings do change in context. So in many languages, people are multilingual. Who you speak to makes a big difference to how you would interpret what they say. They don't have to preface what they say by saying, you know, let's speak Korean now, or let's speak English, or Turrbal, or Yagara. You just speak, and you know from context what's going on. There's quite a devastating critique of large language models and chatbots by Gruden in Computer earlier this year. The words you choose to communicate on an ID differ when you address a group or an individual, a 6-year-old, a high school student, a professor, a friend or a foe, someone familiar with the topic or someone unfamiliar, someone from your culture or another. The words we choose depend on who we're speaking to. And that's something that if we're going to get successful human-robot interaction, most of the time to date, humans have to adapt to robots. If we want robots to work in healthcare or in our homes, the robots need to be able to adapt to us. So they need to understand how to change their language in response to the people they speak to, and then they have to pick up context in any way they can. There are some instances, and on the right, there's a little robot here, which is trying to learn the meaning of the word this. And they ask, trying to learn colors, and they ask, what color do you like of the child? And the child says, this one. So here I want to introduce what happens with prepositions like this. A large language model, if it doesn't have an embodied presence, can't have a grounded meaning for a word like this. So deixis refers to words that point out something or someone. So these are intrinsically contextual. Some of them refer to space, some to time. It can be proximity. It can be words like I am me, you. So all these words fit into challenges for large language models. And in a large language model that gets these correct from a text, it's because in written texts, in a novel, for example, if an author wants to use a word like this, they have to point out in the preceding paragraphs what this is going to refer to. But in common everyday speech, we don't do that. The child doesn't have to indicate what this is going to refer to when the robot asks the question. You know, what's your favorite color? The child can just point to something and say this. All right, so insights from the LingoDroid studies. Words are grounded not in the direct perceptions of the robots, but rather in the integrated navigation system itself. This includes the nodes of the map and the relational distances, relational spaces of distance and direction. And then you can add a whole lot of other different coordinate systems to that. What is important is that common ground depends on shared culture. And so that's understanding the activity that the robots are engaged in, which game they're playing, where are we versus how far, for example. Culture assigns meaning to activities which then become encoded when the robots name common ground. We did a recent study with AI researchers and users looking at human AI interaction, asking what are important considerations. And we were particularly looking at ethics, which scored very highly for the developers. It was quite interesting that developers also felt that explanations would be really important. But for the users, what was really important is that the AI system understands them, not so much that they understand it. And this comes back to getting our robots to be flexible. They need to understand what a person is doing. And this is what this second bullet point is saying, is a shared culture is the robot understanding the task that the human wants to undertake or is considers that they're engaged in. Okay, so how do humans manage uncertainty in conversation? This is going to be, the final point I want to make is that in human conversation, there is actually one word that is understood in every language. I don't know if you can guess what it is, but pretty much, words are arbitrary, except the word, huh. In human language is always, it's pronounced slightly differently in different cultures. Huh, huh. But it's pretty much the same sort of thing. And it comes in and indicates that what's been said is not yet fully understood. And I think with robots, one of the questions is, how do we build in interactions which enable us to say to our robots, huh? And then instead of looking for uncertainty in robot senses, they need to be able to look and manage uncertainty in the interaction dynamics between the robot and the human. And this concept of shared grounding, is there uncertainty in our shared grounding, and how can we refine that over time? So the take-home messages here, I focused on two challenges for human-robot language learning that are deeply important but not solvable by large language models. However, I think they are within reach of robotics. The first one is that the data structures do matter. Words are grounded in human concepts, not just in sensory inputs. Word choice depends on context. Who's the speaker? Who's the listener? One or many? And data structures need to incorporate flexible memory structures that include as yet unknown context. It's not just semantic or large language models. And the second part of this is managing uncertainty. Uncertainty is inherent in human communication. We always say part of what is known and at multiple different levels. Managing uncertainty is actually built into human interaction in person. So to date, as I said earlier, humans mostly adapt to robots, but in applications such as hospitals and aged care, robots will need to adapt to humans, and that includes interactive language use. And I'd like to thank all the different people in the lab over many years who have worked with our robots, our teams, and across psychology, linguistics, neuroscience, and the School of Computer Science and Electrical Engineering. And I will finish here and take questions.
Thanks, Janet, for this very nice talk. Yeah, we do have time for a couple of questions. So are there any from the audience here? Don't be shy.
Hi, Janet. Thanks so much. This is a very interesting set of ideas. So you mentioned that you want robots to adapt to people, and I'm fully on board with this. Do you think that there are some cases where it's okay to ask the human to adapt to the robot? Because we learn how to use technologies and we pick up technologies very quickly. So where do you think is the middle ground here?
Yeah, so I think at the moment, pretty much most of the time the humans are adapting. So I think the first applications will be humans adapting to robots. I think any small steps that robots can go towards adapting to humans will be useful. One of the ones that would be particularly useful is to be able to have a conversation that refines an understanding of common ground or refines an understanding of deixis, what you're referring to in the real world. In cases with things like elder care, I think the robots will have to adapt a lot more, particularly if people have degenerative diseases, so dementia or concerns like aphasia, where they're not able to understand how the technology is working. So I'm not against humans adapting to robots, but I think we need to understand the converse and build our robots in ways that can bring that in, even in principle, because at the moment, in many cases, it's just not there at all.
Any other questions? Yeah, then maybe I have a question. So yeah, also regarding this topic of robots adapting to understanding us humans better. So right now, for example, with ChatGPT, this is pretty much a black box model. So we can ask it, we can give it queries, and that then it will give some reply. But we don't really have a lot of insight into its understanding of what we actually mean, or probably, yeah, there's not much understanding going on. So how do you envision, or do you have some idea in which direction this understanding of machines, of what we humans mean, could be going? Like, will it be more traditional reasoning techniques being involved, or what's, like, how can we realize this? How can we get closer to this, like, from the implementation viewpoint? I know this is very speculative, but maybe you have some ideas in which direction this could be going.
Yeah. So it will be speculative. If we look at how human language models work, so the whole idea of having a language model as a conversation agent misses a lot of how human cognition works. We actually have memory systems that on a single shot can remember what's going on associated with a person. That doesn't mean that includes all of the information in a large language model. We also have I think we have large language models that tell us common ways that grammar works. So you can predict what's happening in a conversation, and then you've got to listen to actually hear what's happening. It turns out that humans do both at the same time. A lot of parts of the brain, you'll have multiple systems all trying to predict what's up next, what's useful. In some cases, you'll need information very quickly. And so whichever system returns first, you might take that and move on. In other cases, you need much more accurate information. So you'll wait and then check it. So I think if you took a large language model and you said, okay, this is a powerful way of encoding a lot of human knowledge, but it doesn't know context, then you would need to add things like an ability to learn new words, to learn words that are used in a particular context and what they mean in that context. When they have been refined in that context, they would then be added to a lexicon, and you'd effectively end up with more than one lexicon. You'd have the specialized lexicon for talking in this context or with these people. But then when the large language model gives you a prediction, you'd also have a system. So humans have system 1 and system 2 thinking. System 1 is very, very fast. If you need to run really, really fast, you would use system 1 to make your decisions. If you need to think about something, you would use system 2. And so large language models don't have any of the checking to know whether the suggestions that they came up with are effective or are accurate or are going to be answering the question. So you then need to add reasoning systems that, if you have time, could go back and check the accuracy, look up the results. I think there are some issues around how large language models at the moment, how ChatGPT does not give access to original sources and cannot actually accurately use it. Humans have a couple of different generalization systems. One loses access to all the instances, like chat, and just guesses and predicts as best it can. The other actually generalizes from specific instances through things like nearest neighbor. And those are two competing systems that most of the time might agree on an answer, but at times they would disagree. And it's how you have an entire cognitive architecture that manages those different systems that I think would give the most powerful approaches in future. That's a very speculative answer, tying it back to human cognitive architectures.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting. Okay. There's a question. Maybe we have time for one more, and then.
Hi, thanks for your very inspiring talk. I just barely find that this kind of language is a distribution slipped from my mind for a long time. And I have a question. So in your talk you mentioned that it is time for for the people to adapt to the robots' behavior, because this kind of ambiguity in the language models or languages, and do you think is it also helpful for the robots to adapt to the human behavior of for example choice of wording and their behavior of their indicating words in their daily speeches, to kind of help robots to narrow down or reduce the ambiguity in the language instructions from human beings?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the really interesting challenges, particularly in language use and in the languages that develop. So we have specialized languages that we use, say, just with children. So when we had the children doing color, we actually had one child who chose the name orange for every single color. She just loved orange. So the robot's learning a very messy representation of what is orange. But for that particular child, the way the memory structures were set up, it was learning that was a specific color for that, related to that child. So if you asked what was her favorite color, the robot could just look it up and every single answer was orange. So it's very easy to answer. That's a case where the robot is not using its knowledge of color, but it's using its experiences and recording. So it didn't just record the name and the color patches, it also recorded who it spoke with. And we started doing that because we were looking at a lot of people are multilingual. So in parts of Northern Australia, the First Nations people would speak up to 10 languages. And how does a child learn to speak the 10 languages? So what we had was in a context vector, the robot would learn not just the word and its meaning, but also who was speaking. And then if it was looking up the meaning of a word or the word for a given meaning, it would know who it was speaking of again. And if it had a record, it could use that directly. And if not, it would try and generalize over the context that was nearest. And what happened is the robots could become multilingual with different people speaking different languages at different times without knowing anything about multilingualism. So that's a very simple instance where a data structure enables the robot to use different words with different people. it can understand all of them, but it can choose to use words that are specific to those people in those contexts. I think that it's a big challenge for robotics to try and meld together these different ways of looking at semantic meanings with the specific labeled terms and different people that that use different ways of expressing themselves. So particularly children, older people, different cultures. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much.
All right, great. Thanks a lot. Let's thank the speaker one more time.